Ne, ne, ne. Nije preko mene. Da, idemo preko mene.
Ne, sad je okej. A možemo krenuti. Dobra večer svima. I hvala što ste nas se pridružili ovu večer. Dakle, večeras nastavljamo drugi razgovor sa Jacobom Wilsom. Znači, nakon prvog razgovora kako do Sindikata podstanara, nastavljamo s diskusijom o konkretnim podstanarskim problemima, analizirajući koje su institucije nadležne za rješavanje podstanarskih problema te promišljanje mogućih rješenja stambene krize u području najma. Nastavit ćemo razgovor na engleskom sa Jacobom, ali slobodno se ubacujte, budući da je ovaj format promišljen kao diskusija sa određenim temama koje se tiču podstanarstva, gdje bi zapravo željeli čuti iz različitih perspektiva kako se određeni problemi mogu artikulirati, kako je stanje iz pojedinih perspektiva. So we can switch in English. So Antonia and I will be having this discussion with Jacob and all the other participants through Zoom. We are also going on Facebook Live. So first to welcome you once again, Jacob. Welcome. So, and I will also give a brief intro on Jacob. So Jacob Wills is a community organizer with a history in direct action and squatting movements, and his long-term experience as an activist in the housing movement led him to set up London's Renters Union, što bi bio sindikat londonskih podstanara, where he now works as an organizer. Jacob was also a co-coordinator of European Action Coalition for Right to Housing and the City. Jacob, following the first conversation, maybe we can open up this discussion on specific issues, starting with contract control and land control, and specific type what you have as licensing.
Mm-hmm. I will take this one to start the discussion, and I would like to say good evening to everybody, and welcome to the discussion, and thank you you joined us tonight. Speaking about contract control and landlord control, we would like to start with the kind of information that it's in Croatia due to a number of reasons, signing contract. It's not a practice that is still prevalent or very common, and in the cases it is. And people are signing contracts. They're often not very good and not very favorable for the tenants. And Jacob, what's the situation in London? What's your experience?
Sure. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming along. I hope we can find some interesting kind of comparisons. So I am going to guess here that there's actually quite a big legal difference between our contexts, in that I don't really know what the proportion of people with or without contracts is in the UK or in London, but here you have rights as a tenant that exist whether or not they're written into I don't know whether or not that's the same, but sometimes people are given agreements that kind of say this is just a license agreement, it's not a full tenancy. We have a a kind of staircase of tenants' rights, from an excluded occupier. If you live with your landlord, you don't have so many rights. To go to court, for example, for eviction and this sort of thing. A licensee who has some more rights, like property guardians are often licensees, like Camelot and stuff like that, or a full tenant. But whether or not you have is defined by the court based on the facts of the matter, rather than whether or not you have a contract that says you're a tenant. So if you pay a certain rent for a defined time period, like every week, every month, what have you, for a room or for a defined space that you have exclusive occupation of, you're very likely a tenant. And most of the rights that we have exist because we're defined as a tenant, rather than because they're written into a contract. And so often the arguments we have in courts or whatever are less about what it was written in the tenancy agreement, and are more about whether or not someone can be defined as a tenant or not. Obviously, sometimes, you know, I've seen absolutely wild contracts where landlords write, you know, you have to feed my rabbit every Tuesday or whatever, this sort of thing. And there's a lot of stuff that is like clearly, or some stuff that just goes against the law, basically. So maybe they say, if the boiler breaks, you have to fix it. These terms are unreasonable terms and they're illegal. And so we spend time with tenants kind of working through, oh, just because it says that in your contract, the contract is not as strong as statutory law. Go on, sorry.
Regarding licensing, which is something unfamiliar to our context. So licensing means registration of landlords in a way, right? So we do have this kind of approach in tourism. So when letting some units to tourists, you are obligated basically to register to the tourist office, state tourist office and local, depending on the situation. But it's strange that we do not have here this practice of registration when you are renting or housing. So maybe you can give us some explanation. How does it work in UK and in London regarding licensing?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, licensing is really interesting development in the UK. It's what the kind of reformist left are quite keen on, and we're keen on it too, when it works in favor of tenants. But there are ways that licensing can work to marginalize some people at the bottom end of the sector. I'll explain a little bit about that. So our licensing, in fact, is not a landlord register, but a property register. So every property needs to get a license. And there are some basic minimum standards that are defined and that a local council can set and local authority can determine in order for something to have a license. And that for us, and I'm jumping into, you know, what organized tenants can do, but that's really important because it is a mechanism for us to say to the local council, you should introduce these conditions and say, you know, landlords have to, I don't know, you know, rent at a low rent or agree never to evict anyone or what have you in order to get a license. There's a bit of wiggle room there on the local level, despite having quite a strong kind of national legislative framework. So licensing has to be requested by a local council from the Secretary of State. And currently, we don't have a Secretary of State who's very amenable to tenants' rights. And that's been the case for quite a long time, in fact. So, in fact, they have to jump through lots of hoops in order to get an agreement for a certain area of the borough to be licensed, and it has to be renewed, and they have to prove how it's helped to drive up standards and lessen antisocial behavior and this sort of thing. There are some boroughs, some local authorities that have full licensing, so every property that in the private rental sector has to have a license. There's many places where only a house of multiple occupation needs a license, and that is a house where you have 3 or more separate households. So if you were
unions,
like if you were 4 students living together,
okay,
be a house of multiple occupation, or if you were a number of families all sharing or something like that, but it's not a family home, for example. So all HMOs need licensing across the UK, but local authorities can request to ensure that everyone has to have a license, or all landlords. The local authorities get 500 quid or something from the landlords. They rarely use it in order to actually drive up standards. Some local authorities go and check every property before they issue the license. That makes a lot of sense. Most of them don't, and we're currently campaigning for them to use a lot of the powers that they have to fine landlords for compensation, etc. Another thing that we're doing is that councils aren't using the powers that they have often. They're underfunded, they don't have the enforcement officers, and this is a long-term aim of the regulatory system actually, well, not the system, but the enforcement process matching some of the laws that we've managed to win. But in the meantime, tenants themselves can take landlords to court. So if you are renting somewhere that doesn't have a license, as of 2 or 3 years ago, you can apply for a rent repayment order and get up to 12 months of rent back.
This is very interesting,
which is a really big deal, you know, and it takes a lot of work, but we are supporting our members to do it. We're trying to streamline a process. We're also, you know, trying to make sure we don't just become a cash cow like service providing union, you know, but it's a way that we can also campaign and knock landlords out of business, perhaps, if we identify that they rent many properties illegally when they should have licenses. So in order to kind of work on that, I might actually, can you give me the rights to share screen? Maybe I have it.
Second. Can you try now?
Great. So this is a like a database that I have been creating. Well, I have got some tech people to create, using like scraping various different boroughs. We're at the beginning of the process here, but these boroughs have to, you know, have these the licensing data publicly available. They don't, but we can do a freedom of information request and then get the information for all of the licensed properties. So here you can see, I mean, we've just got it. And I created this because I wanted to use that data in order to do door knocking and go and speak to the private renters in that area and be able to map where we were reaching out to for an organizing drive. So here you can see these gray spots are areas that we've done more door knocking in a certain time.
But what would you do? Basically, you would come to the flat where you see you have the data that it is licensed. So there is some letting activity, and you would go and check basically if that corresponds to the data.
Well, what I want to do is talk to the tenant. So I would go and I would be there. This isn't the view that the door knocker has, but I would talk to them, you know, about what we're doing locally, whatever is going on, the campaign, etc. if I might click wants to join, and then it will go into our union sign-up page, right?
Okay.
With the address and stuff like this.
So it's basically getting people to know about the London Renters Union, so about the Sindikata, as we call it, and basically creating a network of people to organize who are basically in a condition of tenants.
Exactly, and it's a way for us without any register of private, you know, we're having to create our own kind of data basically. The other thing that I could do with it is use it, you know, if I speak to someone and I find out, I don't know, actually, let me look at landlords. Search for Rakesh Patel because I've met someone, they have a problem with this landlord. And then I go and look at, you know, his, oh, look, well, I mean, this is why it's not, the data is, you know, a bit kind of confused. But through this, I can see, oh, actually, here's all the properties that this guy owns that we can see. He probably also owns properties that are unlicensed because he's a total cowboy. I've been organizing a campaign against this guy.
He has quite a lot of properties that we can see.
He's got a lot of properties. He's the biggest HMO landlord in Tower. And, you know, what this can allow is for us to actually start being more strategic in our campaigns so that we're not only saying, come and support other renters in your area. We're also saying, come and support other renters who have a problem with your landlord. Maybe you have a similar problem because this landlord is an asshole. Yeah, that's been fairly successful. But once we actually build the data density up, I think it's going to be even more helpful.
I think this shows great how you can basically network and use the data. And when translating to our context, it would be great to first of all start with having this kind of form of licensing in the first hand, in a way, because without it, it's quite impossible. It's basically impossible to have a list like you have, to see who owns and how much, basically, and to create this kind of network.
This is a kind of data our housing units of local housing unit in the city of Zagreb. They, according to the law, they do collect that kind of data, but it's really not well organized. We've been talking to them, and they're saying to us, yes, we do have some collected contracts that we have been collecting since 2014, according to this and that law, but we cannot tell you not even how many contracts it was collected during 1 year. And much less in what kind of in which areas I don't know how are the dynamics of letting in which areas of the city. It's a kind of data is really not usable, and it is supposed to be used from the city authorities to I don't know, to assure, for example, the median price of rent in some area of the city.
Yeah. So basically, without having this data, even when looking from administrative perspective from the cities, it's very difficult to manage the rental price, which we do have somehow inscribed in law, that in some way should be regulated. But when you don't have this basic data, you cannot even work furthermore on regulating this kind of stuff. So I think this licensing can serve as a great example, first as a way of registering all the properties that are being used for rental market, and then also for organizing with other tenants, as you are doing in London's Renters Union. But continuing with this network, basically, you are creating, We can open up the topic of discrimination, but also I would like to hear people from audience if maybe they have some comments already on this topic regarding licensing and contract. So I would just remind people to feel free to join anytime in the discussion, whether in chat or live through Zoom, to see basically how can we to our cities and maybe through national laws also apply this kind of regulation. Yeah.
And if nobody.
Yeah, maybe we can continue on to discrimination issue, and it would be great also to hear people from audience. I think there are some participants who has been working also with people in movement. So to see how can we, what kind of discrimination do people encounter once they are searching for a flat? How is the situation in London, Jacob? I mean, what are the most common issues you encounter?
I think probably the most common issues are about benefit status, whether or not you claim housing benefit specifically, which helps pay your rent, and probably racial discrimination as well. They're both very hard to measure. But I mean, we once did mystery shopping of like 50 letting agents in my area of London, which shows you how many letting agents there are just in my borough out of 26 boroughs, you know. And I called up 50 of these people. It was a terrible day. And asked for any properties that were available to someone on housing benefit, and I found one property.
So maybe to be clear, when you say housing benefit, that means somebody's status is in a way he gets some benefit from the state.
Subsidized.
So it's
exactly,
which kind of implies that it's kind of a social category, which means that people have issues with letting their apartments to them.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, there's different forms of that prejudice, right? There's a socialized prejudice against benefit claimants, which has been really ramped up in the last decade in the UK with the Tory governments and austerity. Just to say, I mean, half of the people in London who are on housing benefit are also working. So this isn't a category of people who are out of work. This is a category of people who are underemployed, unemployed, casualized, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. It's very normal to be on housing benefit. It just means you're kind of poor. And letting agents don't want people because they think, I don't know, there are problems with the state payment system, which are primarily experienced by the tenant, the receiver, but landlords get pissed off about it too. But yeah, more and more we're seeing letting agents say, you have to give us all of the money. Like, we'll give you a 6-month contract and you have to give us all of the money up front. That's the only way that we're going to give you a place to live, and people are borrowing large sums of money in order to do that. I'll just briefly say on racialized discrimination, we have a new law here called Right to Rent, which is really problematic and which there's been some legal challenges to, but it basically says if you don't have status, if you're an undocumented migrant, you can't get a contract with a landlord, and the landlord is liable for a large fine if they rent to someone who's undocumented. So landlords legally have to photocopy your passport and stuff like that in order to rent to you. Obviously, it means that landlords just say, oh, that's a foreign looking name, I'm not going to rent to you because I might end up getting fined. and that sort of thing, as well as just, you know, broader prejudice against people of color around, you know, I don't know, they're going to be out of work and hanging around in the house all day, messing up the carpets or whatever. So that links to what I was speaking about in terms of licensing, because we need to have a tenant-centered kind of licensing. There are situations where we've had members who've reported their landlord for not having a license, and then either there's been home office repercussions because they didn't have status, or they've been evicted because the councillor said, oh, well, your landlord doesn't have the right to rent this property, so we're going to evict you, which is obviously totally counter to you know, our vision of why we would be introducing these sorts of laws. So I think that we've got to be careful about how they're implemented, basically.
Definitely. Eva has a question from the audience, so Eva, please, if you want.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question about these housing benefits, because we have been talking about them over here also, and now that you say that you mentioned tenant-based licensing or any kind of tenant-based help is quite important to understand where it comes from or how is it used. For example, if you have housing benefits, if they go directly to the landlord, then the landlord knows that you are on benefits. From what I understand, for example, the new law or ordinance, I'm not sure what, in Spain, allows you to receive directly money for rent. If you are underemployed, if you're under certain age, unemployed or something like that, you get a certain amount of money in order to help you with rent. It's your landlord does not need to know that you are in this kind of position. So this kind of housing benefits that are employing landlords to understand that you are in this position are counterproductive in a way. This is what we have. This is what we have when it comes to asylum seekers, and when it comes to, for example, now those who have been victims of earthquake. So there is no direct giving. The state will not give you money directly for rent, because of course you will be not responsible. But they give you in terms of these, like in way of certain way of these housing benefits. So no, I just wanted to comment on this, how it is quite important to whom you give the money. And there has been for a long time this policy that money should go directly to the landlord, not to the tenant, as I understand also.
Yeah, and so in the UK, we've got, you can tick a box on your benefit application for whether or not it's going to come to you or go directly to the landlord. And lots of people do it under the radar. However, letting agents, much more than landlords, in fact, letting agents are very tight on, you know, looking at your bank statements before you get something to, so it's really every time you have to move house, you have to like make sure it looks like you have enough money. I had to like Photoshop my bank statements to make it look like I had regular income because I was on long-term disability benefits. And lots of people obviously don't have access to that sort of thing. So yeah, so that they introduce various kind of barriers. One more thing to say on housing benefit is, you know, during COVID, there was a bit of an uplift and they kind of increased it, or they brought it back in line with inflation over the last few years. It's meant to cover the bottom third of the sector, and it absolutely doesn't, the level of housing benefit. So many people are really impoverished and using other wages in order to top it up. The issue we have is that we want people to have enough benefits, but also the state is paying an absolute incredible amount. I can't remember, it's, you know, something like 120 £25 billion across the UK or something per year. It's like really astronomical. I can't remember the figure offhand, so don't quote me. But and you know, as long as we keep pushing the benefits up, the rents keep going up. The state runs out of money, and actually, you know, what we need instead is forms of rent control, rather than the state just kind of pushing more and more money into the hands of private landlords. And that's a complicated thing for us as a tenants union, trying to have radical demands, but also, you know, support our members' needs in the here and now.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned, maybe we can go maybe you can explain what is rent control, and basically how does it work? We do not have this kind of system, although we do have something inscribed in law, but we can see, maybe you can explain how it works actually.
Sure. You know, to be clear, I won't be describing much of an actuality, because we don't really, we have no controlled rents in the private sector here. We do have a form of controlled rents in social housing, and rents are raised by a very, you know, complex and very opaque process, which isn't clear to people. The government can make decisions around that. So the government, for example, froze council rents during near the kind of end of austerity, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, and said that they couldn't raise them by 1% as they would have. In fact, interestingly, that was not a very progressive move. Council rents are pretty low. People probably, you know, people were hit by a lot of things that were far more expensive than the 1%, you know, in line with inflation rent rise. And what it meant is local councils suddenly trying to run loads of services in the middle of austerity had billions of pounds less from really large numbers of council tenants who would all have been paying, you know, 50p more or something like that. So there's questions about, you know, how controlled rents are used politically as well. But in essence, when we're talking about the private sector, there's various different forms that rent control can take. There's a proportion of local incomes, which requires, you know, a decent level of data that we don't have that well here a bit. I will mention on, because you spoke about rent levels and data, there's no collection of rent levels in the UK of that kind of data. It's something that we're pushing for, because without it, it's very hard to have these sorts of conversations. But it's basically by looking at, you know, big private letting agents that you can assess what's happening in the market. There's models of rent control that are linked to inflation, saying you can't go more than 10% above inflation. So it's kind of a stabilization mechanism rather than necessarily pushing it down. I believe that's what they had in Berlin, or maybe still have. And it basically prevents rents from rising, I don't know, 50% between contracts. There's also rent control that exists solely within a contract in some places that have quite long-term contracts, that say you can't raise the rent within a 5-year contract very much at all. But at the end of that contract, you can do whatever you want. Or if you renovate a bit, you can really hike the rent. So we see this in Scandinavia quite a lot with the renovictions crisis, where they're kind of painting it and putting a new counter in and then renting it for double the price, sort of thing. So the sorts of rent control that we're pushing for here are ones that are based on income, and we think that nobody should have to spend more than a third of their income on rent. I'm pretty sure 15, 20 years ago, people said no one should spend more than a quarter on rent. But that feels so far away here in London, where lots of people pay 60-70% of their wages on rent. That, yeah, we're trying to find a way to move towards a system which wouldn't be a cliff edge, because it would be total chaos in the sector, to introduce it overnight, but to gradually bring rents down in relation to inflation as well, to certain levels. And that would require a whole infrastructure that doesn't exist in the UK at the moment, both in terms of collecting data, in terms of assessing what a desired rent level might be, all those sorts of things. And that does exist in many places. One other form that I didn't mention, in fact, is I think the Danish model or something, where the rent is set not related to the market whatsoever, or not related to income, but through an assessment of the property itself and how big it is and what kind of utilities it has and that sort of thing, and attempting to kind of value those things. So when we talk about rent control, it's a really, like, there's so many forms, and our experience is anytime you say this is the kind we want, you open yourself up to attack. And in fact, what's quite important is building the principle of controlled rents, and what the aims of it would be, where it would get you to. And then work out the system after that, is my sense.
But in UK, they, I don't know, until the end of 80s, there used to be some kind of rent control, which is, I don't know, left during the 90s. And what does, I don't know, when do you see this big spike in inaffordability of private rent in London, and what does it mean for I don't know, big groups of people facing this inaffordability?
So you're totally right, and I said there is no rent control in the private rented sector. That's not true. There's a small number of tenants who still have contracts from over 30 years ago. It's quite rare to see nowadays, because most landlords have made them sign new ones. But there you have access to a fair rents kind of tribunal, where if you think that your rent is pushed up too much, you can go to the tribunal and get an adjudication. That adjudication, in fact, can go either way, and it's final. So they can say, actually, we think you should be paying more rent. So you have to be careful with it, but either way, it's not very common. So Thatcher deregulated the market with the Housing Act in '88, and the spike in rents really, I mean, I think it was happening slowly through the 90s, but really the big spike in rents started in the mid 2000s, and you know, it basically affects everybody, and the question is how it affects you know, people in the middle of the sector, by meaning that actually people are very impoverished because they pay a lot to have a decent flat in zone 2 or 3, like fairly central, and they have very little money for anything else. It means that people work all the time in London. It means there's an impoverishment of our cultural and community organizations. It's very difficult to, you know, be a full-time activist or organizer, all these sorts of things. It has, you know, broad impacts on movements as well. But even those people who are paying quite low rents comparatively are only doing so because they are pushed to the fringes of the city. So we're seeing many people pushed out and living, you know, 10 miles out from the center of the city, and having to take 2 buses to get their kids to school, and then another, you know, bus to get to work. And, you know, that transport's very expensive here. The amount of time you have to actually sell your labor is quite restricted when there's lots of, you know, people with families and that sort of thing. So and childcare is extremely expensive. So it's kind of a perfect storm, which has led to incredibly high levels of poverty in London, despite it being, you know, a very wealthy city in the 5th richest country in the world or something. It also has created, I think, a bit of a tidal wave of people saying, wait, no, we have shared interest here. And that's what the Renters Union was born out of in some way. Rent control is, although it's like a long-term, medium-term aspiration for us, and we are organizing around it. We've got the Mayor of London to come out in favor of it, which is easy because he can't implement it, and it's a popular policy. We're trying to get more local councils to come out in favor in order to get the major charities like Shelter and Crisis behind it, because currently they're not, because it's not politically you know, winnable. So in a way, we're trying to kind of move some of the blocks in order to be able to have a path to victory on it. And although rents is one of the things that angers people most and makes people, you know, activates people, a lot of the things that we organize around in the day-to-day is more like disrepair, homelessness, eviction, because we have a lot more powers around it and we don't have a lot of leverage around rents. I just saw the message in the chat.
Eva, is why cannot the mayor implement the rent control?
Because it's not an aspect of the system that's decentralized, basically.
So it's on the state kind of level administration that needs to kind of push for this kind of mechanism. Yeah, I mean, we could in a way, and we do have some kind of law prescription that coming back to contracts and signing the contract, that there is a law regulating that a contract should be deposited by the city administration, which is not at all kind of being applied in practice in Croatia. And in this way, cities could also see who the mentioned licensing, they could see who is letting, so you could see who is basically using the property for rent. And also the city could collect this data for to follow the price of rent. So we are missing this mechanism, which you also mentioned. So tracing the rent amount and also the licensing. But we do have possibility of pushing for this politics on local level, which you said it's not that feasible in UK. So I think there's quite a margin for us to urge and advocate for these kind of policies, especially in larger cities like Zagreb, Split, Rijeka, and other larger cities. And I think rent control, it's strictly regulated, strictly connected with this. We do have a gray market in a way where a lot of rental units are not being not only registered, but they're not, people are renting without contract. So we were speaking about this before, but I forgot to ask you, where can people go? Is there an institution where people can go to check their contracts, or if something is not being followed? So if somebody wants to evict you, where can you go? How is the situation in London? Is there any direct address where you can go and beyond your organization, which is kind of an activist, but is there
can you I don't know, can you come to the council and ask for help if you have some I don't know, some kind of conflict with your landlord?
So not really. You can go to the council in order to apply to make a homelessness application on the basis of your eviction. The council is now, since a law a couple of years ago, the council is supposed to do homelessness prevention as well as homelessness relief, which should involve supporting tenants to negotiate with their landlord, or I don't know, set up a repayment plan for rent arrears and stuff. That doesn't happen in practice whatsoever, and councils are way too overrun and don't prioritize it enough to really give any significant support to tenants around stuff. There are some, there are around disrepair, which we'll come on to, I guess. If that being a breach of contract, that is something that you can go to the local council for. It's something that we support our members to do sometimes, to get an inspection done by the environmental health team, which is the department that it sits under.
And that's the city administration, right?
Yeah.
The local authority, yeah, so the borough. And they have these officers who will come and do an inspection. They may send a letter to the landlord saying you have to repair XYZ within a certain time frame, and if that doesn't happen, they can issue what's called an improvement notice. And that's a legal framework through which the landlord is obliged to get the property up to standard, and if they don't, they can be fined. In practice, councils are not fining landlords very much. They don't like to go to court. They don't have very many resources, and they are worried, and they think, oh, it's easier to just have a quiet word. And part of our campaigns is to try and get them to, use their teeth a little bit, because you're obviously not going to get any culture change amongst how landlords operate unless you're actually, chasing them down when they're breaking the law. But in terms of eviction, there's not very much support. In terms of, breaches of contract in general, apart from disrepair, very little. Some councils do now have some people working to help people do rent repayment orders. If, for example, your landlord doesn't have a license. So we're going and doing an action tomorrow. Although I think I have COVID, so I think I can't go, frustratingly, but our group in Tower Hamlets in the East End of London is taking action with a member, Amina, who is living with 8 children in a 2-bedroom flat, and the boiler is broken, and there was a flood a couple of years ago, and there's terrible damp and mold, and the estate agent is saying, oh, I'm not going to talk to you, actually, I'm not going to. He's literally lying, saying, oh, I don't manage the property anymore, and the landlord has confirmed that he does. So we're going to go down there, and we, Amina came to us with those issues. I've done some research, and it turns out that the property isn't licensed, and it should be, because it's in an area of the borough where all properties need to be licensed. And that will be part of our threat to the estate agent in our action when we go into the office tomorrow and try to negotiate with them. And we'll say, you need to fix this, you need to fix that, da-da-da. If you don't, and this depends, we might chase them legally anyway, but we'll say, like, we are going to speak to the local council, we're going to get them and support a fine and compensation claim to happen because you don't have a license, and for the disrepair. So you can sue, with a private solicitor, you can sue your landlord for those breaches of license, of contract for the disrepair. That's a lot more normal, I would say, than people going to the council, is saying, I need to find a lawyer. Sometimes we support our members to do that. Sometimes we hook them up with solicitors. We're doing that with Amina as well, so that often we have a legal route and we have a direct action route, and they kind of support one another at some level.
Yeah, this is very interesting, because as we do not have this kind of entity such as London's Renters Union, tenants in Croatia are mostly organized in these Facebook groups where basically they convene just when searching for an apartment. But other than that, we don't have any more homogeneous group which would act. Actually, what we are trying to do through Right to the City also is kind of organizing people and providing information. But through your words, it shows basically that even state and city does not provide any direct response, so, which is same in Croatia. So if this discrimination is happening, if disrepair is present, you basically do not have any direct action which could reply to your needs, but you need to go legally, which can go for months and years, basically. So we are really in lack of any mechanisms that would quickly resolve these kind of issues. So yeah, this responds basically also to discrimination, which happens where it's even worse, because discrimination is usually quite vaguely described, and we have ombudsman, which kind of counters with all issues on discrimination. It's almost impossible to tackle the issue of discrimination when you face it when searching and when you're in housing, I think. Maybe you know of some other practices regarding the discrimination that.
Well, I as in I don't know, as in other cases of I don't know, well, starting from breaching tenant contract or not respecting in any kind this relationship between tenants and landlords. Discrimination based on things like sexual orientation or ethnicities. Most of the things just ends on the at the legal level, which is the only, I don't know, the only space it could be I don't know, advocated for from some kind of resolvement. We do know some examples of of people being discriminated based on their sexual orientation, and only thanks to the fact the person worked in an NGO that was interested to I don't know, to
go in legal fight, right?
Yeah, to go in legal fight with the lawyers they were employing, to go in legal fight against the private landlord, not willing to let the apartment for to a gay person. They, I don't know,
managed to
they managed to, well, not to get that apartment because the person didn't want it in the end, but to, I don't know, to get the things, yes, yeah, to get justice
in a way. We have a question also and raised hand from Anna Maria, so please.
Yes, hello. I hope you hear me well. I have this pretty bad headphones, so I'm not sure, but great, I hope it's good. Okay, yes, great. So I'm Anna Maria. I'm a coordinator of integration in Are You Serious? We are NGO in Croatia, based in Zagreb, who works with refugees, asylum seekers, and people with international protection. So speaking of discrimination, I think it's quite my area. So I just would like to share some things from our experience. So in Croatia, when people get a refugee status, they have a right of 2 years for money help about housing. Now in practice, usually they are in statal apartments, but after these 2 years, they should rent a private property with their own money. And that is the time point when everything gets really bad. Why? Because even if people work and they have amount of money that is needed for renting private property, mostly when they call or even when we call and explain the situation, landlords are not willing to rent them. And it comes from the clearly discrimination sentences, like we don't want foreigners or we don't want refugees. to the some like more sophisticated things when they say, yes, we will call you, but never they call, or they say like, we already rented to someone else, or they're asking, like Jacob said, like 6 months rent in advance, which, you know, like mostly people, not just refugees, like I think most people don't have that amount of money. And also what is the big problem, but it comes from not understanding the law, is that most of the landlords don't want to rent because they don't want to give people the address, because they think that for giving the address to person who is occupying the apartment, they need to go to the notary and like make the contract public, that which means they need to pay taxes for renting. And in Croatia, most of the landlords don't want to do that. But actually in practice, they just need to go to the police and register person. It's not connected with one and the other. They just can go with the person and say, this person is living in my apartment and I want to register him on this address. But because most of them don't know this, and these people need to have address because they don't have any other address except the one they're living in, they don't want, when they hear, for example, they need to be registered, they say no. and you cannot do anything about that. I know like people who were facing becoming homeless even if they work, because they couldn't find apartment. And I think in Croatia it's really hard, especially if a family have like more children, they don't want to rent, and if they hear like refugee family with children, then like your chances to find home with some normal price, not overpriced, it's like really, really low.
And did you ever went into a legal battle to kind of, when you have this kind of discrimination, did you report? I mean, I know it's kind of a waste of time knowing how slow our institutions are, but did you ever encounter this way of trying to go through legal justice, basically, in these cases?
No, we didn't, because like in this kind of cases, we are more focusing to find people, you know, place to live, because it's always some sort of emergency. And also they are just focused on that they find the apartment, because they don't want to be homeless. And, you know, in the case of homelessness, they would be separated from children if they are families. So they are just focused on finding some apartment. And then like, in a lot of cases, they end up in overpriced apartment with really bad conditions.
Yeah, this is unfortunately the case. And through some initiatives, through also CMS and the initiatives which Antonia mentioned, we should try to organize also to address these issues and change basically the legal response, which should be much quicker in this case, because slowness basically of institution in this case is equal to not reacting in a way. So it's also institutional discrimination happening every time we encounter with this issue. And I would like to also follow your thoughts, Anna Maria, regarding homelessness, what you mentioned, because we usually associate homelessness only with people without home, so people on the street, which is quite simple and I would say wrong narrative, because homelessness is much larger than this basically. And I would maybe also address, you were, Andrea, mentioning the risk of homelessness, which is basically results when you cannot find an apartment, and which is linked to discrimination again. So there's the whole chain basically that leads to this, and we only perceive homelessness when people are on the street. So maybe Jacob, you could also say how it is in London, and how do you address these issues, and how do you perceive homelessness, the status in your context?
Sure. Thanks. And I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of people without status or applying for residency and that sort of thing, in terms of that moment when people are then looking on the private market and what people are forced to accept. For us, there's a really large homeless population in London and also moving out of London. And that is the kind of direction of travel whenever someone ends a contract, whether they're about to find another one but further out, or they don't find one and they go to the local council for support. So local councils are obliged to provide some sort of support, and we often fight with them about the level of that support. If you're a single, well, often a single man, but also a single woman who is kind of middle-aged without a particular health complaint, or I don't know, drug misuse issues or what have you, it's very difficult to get housed. And there are two tracks if you approach a local council to make a homelessness application. You can either, what normally happens is that you're given some sort of emergency housing unless they refuse you straight up. They have 5 things that they're exploring into it, and often these applications take years and years, and it's a huge amount of money that they spend researching your uncle's house in Bulgaria and whether there's a spare room there that you could be living in, this sort of thing. Really, like, I've been in meetings with these people where this is going on, and they're very long processes to determine whether or not someone actually has nowhere else to go, whether someone is intentionally homeless, which is the phrase used if you're been evicted because you had rent arrears, because you weren't able to pay your rent. The council can then refuse to house you on the basis that it's your fault that you got evicted. And various other aspects of, do you have a connection to the local area, and these sorts of things. More and more local councils are discharging their duty, even if they say after 3 years, yes, you're right, you didn't actually have a home, and we've kept you in this hostel for 3 years while we assess your application. They will then say, we're going to discharge our duty into the private rented sector. So you go right back into the sector. The council pays a landlord an extra incentive bonus in order to take on a benefit claimant who has like some secure amount of money coming from the state. Please take these tenants, and then the landlord can give you a 6-month contract and evict you at the end of it, and you're back around the cycle again. So it's a real like tight wheel that people are caught in. Often many people have gone through these homelessness application processes multiple times. They're quite traumatic and very long and stressful and inaccessible. Some people are given a council flat, social housing from the state at a lowered rent, but there aren't very many council flats available because the state has sold them off or demolished them. More usual is that the local authority will say, well, actually, there's lots of houses in Birmingham because nobody wants to live in Birmingham because there's no jobs there, and you're on benefits anyway, so it doesn't really matter to you, so we'll send you to one of these houses in Birmingham. And it's very difficult. The legal challenges to these things are quite complicated and often quite unwinnable. And so huge numbers of Londoners are being forced away from their support networks and communities into like small towns in the rest of the country, if they're even accepted at all. There's a lot of people who are in what's called temporary accommodation, and you might be in that for years, as I say, while they assess your application. Some of them are hostels, some of them are, you know, I was working with a member who's got 2 little kids, 2 little girls. She was in a hostel for years with 400 people, with only like shared bathrooms between lots of people. The kids weren't allowed in the corridors on their own. There was no cooking facilities in there, no cooking facilities, and she was living there with kids for years. And if you wanted to get food from the kind of canteen, it was in an hour slot in the morning and the evening or whatever. There's like huge numbers of people in these kind of like detention like facilities, basically, because because of the crime of not having a home and being evicted, and being evicted from the private rented sector is the leading cause of homelessness in the UK. Maybe I'll wonder if you've got any more specific questions, because otherwise I'll just ramble about all different aspects. No,
I don't know, we thought of asking you to describe this, I don't know, where the scale of precarity, in housing precarity, that would be applicable for I don't know, for getting a council housing, and is there I don't know, but now you are explaining that the situation on those, I don't know, lists for council housing, it's already quite crowded, but I don't know, is there a chance? Well, when we talk about I don't know, a couple of days ago, you mentioned well, situations, people living in overcrowded apartments. Do you have any chance to try to ask for housing benefit, or I don't know, council housing, if you can I don't know, if you can demonstrate you are living in, I don't know, this kind of conditions?
They hand out housing benefit fairly openly, you know, is generally not, you know, that's, you don't, sorry. For housing benefit, all you have to do is prove that you're poor, and that's generally easier than proving to a letting agent that you're rich and you have enough money. So quite a lot of people, you know, generally there's quite widespread access to housing benefit unless you have no recourse to public funds, which is a particular category applied to many migrants who aren't allowed to rent, basically, to use, sorry, they're not allowed to use state benefits, basically, until they've been given a residency. In terms of applying for social housing, I mean, Amina, the Somali woman who we're doing the action with tomorrow, who I mentioned, she lives in a 2-bed flat with her 8 kids, some of whom are adults now. She's been on the council waiting list for 18 years. And she's bidding. So we have, I mean, it's probably important to explain this, because it's a bit of a weird system. I don't know if it's the same, but we have a homelessness process where you make a homelessness application, and you can be officially recognized as having a legitimate application, and then you will be housed, whether in social housing or the private rented sector. We also have like the council waiting lists, and most working class people, or lots of working class people, are on the council waiting list, and you're trying to get your council flat and you wait a really long time, and you have a bidding category depending on your vulnerabilities, your, you know, the issues, your level of marginalization, etc. And then with that category, you can apply to say, I want to get that house, please, or that one. And, you know, Amina, tomorrow, she needs a 5-bed house because she's got 9 kids. And there are no 5-bed houses, and the state isn't building them because the numbers look better if you build 2 2-bed flats than 1 5-bed. So she officially can bid, but she's not going to get anywhere, and she's in fact started to like say, oh, the kids have gone away, so she can try and get a smaller place, even though they will in fact all have to live together and be overcrowded if she does get a 4-bed. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question in terms of what it allows you. You have the right to apply, but you don't get anything, unfortunately.
Yeah, we are aware of it, and well, the situation here is it's similar. There are endless lists of the people who applied and can prove they're in need, but yes, the housing stock available, it's always too inadequate.
Yeah, and for instance, at the moment we are dealing with some Roma community, which for decades is trying to, which lives in enormously precarious conditions, substandard conditions on the outskirts of Zagreb. And some of them are also on waiting list for more than 10 years without any indication when their request for housing might be resolved. So we have this kind of similar issues and inadequate responses from the local governments until now to these specific issues, be it regarding the number of rooms, which is specially crafted for specific families, be it for specific communities, which might be searching for decent housing. Before we wrap up with maybe what could we do through advocacy and lawmaking based on this experience, I would once again try to open the floor also for questions from the audience, if there are any, to hear and reflect maybe on these issues. We've covered discrimination, the concept of rent control, and how is renting actually and licensing working in London, and how it could work in Zagreb. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to join in. Okay, I guess there are no comments or questions, so maybe we could wrap up just briefly on we've covered in last conversation how London Renters Union is working in organization but also advocacy. So maybe just to hear briefly what can we do in terms of making laws better and influencing basically when laws are being brought regarding rental and housing. So how does it work in your context? I mean, we talked briefly last time. You are trying to push through public actions and advocate basically for housing rights. So if you can maybe briefly explain. Yeah.
Sure. I'll start with the local council level just because we've been speaking about it already a bit, and then just speak briefly about the national level because we haven't spoken about it so much. On the local level, you know, we're mostly talking about policies rather than laws, I guess. And we have local elections in May of 2022. So we're currently building campaigns, like specific campaigns in the various boroughs we're organizing in. So maybe 7 or 8 campaigns probably. There are some shared demands around, you know, council enforcement processes, around councils coming out in favor of rent control, around temporary accommodation and the provision of homelessness accommodation locally rather than sending people out of the borough, and these sorts of things. And we will have negotiations with probably the mayors of the local authorities. Some of those, we've had meetings with them before, and it will be, they will tell us how glad they are to hear the voice of private renters. And if we start speaking about their decisions about their own housing stock, about social housing, about sell-offs, etc., they will get quite stressed out and frustrated and try to bring it back to, rogue landlords being the problem. Some of them it will be harder to get a meeting with, and we will take action and put some public pressure on in order to force them to meet with us. We expect to win some demands through that process around how the councils are functioning locally. It's the first time, in a way, as a union, these elections are every 4 to 5 years, and we only set up in 2018, so it's kind of a new process for us as a union to work out what we can win through kind of putting that public pressure on collectively. What we do think is that, a lot of council leaders speak to each other. They say, oh, look, we got pushed to do this. Actually, it's quite a good idea and it works quite well and we could make some money out of it, and this sort of thing. So our framework is very much that we want to put some pressure on to get into the room and have a negotiation where we're talking about shared interests, rather than, just shouting at people for, their failures, however much that is tempting. And so yeah, I guess I'm saying I'm confident that we are going to win some stuff through that sort of a process. But at the end of the day, local councils don't have loads of powers. Part of our campaign is trying to not let them off the hook, because they always say, oh, well, we just can't do anything and it's the government's fault. And they do have things they could be doing, and those haven't been explored by housing organisations or by local councils very much. But we also need to push on the wider level. So we pressurise the GLA, the Greater London Assembly, of which Sadiq Khan, the mayor, is the head. And we have meetings with their private rented sector team kind of semi-regularly. And we kind of, they like hearing our perspective, and because they don't have loads of power, they can come out with some things that are a bit more radical sometimes, or at least pushing things a little bit. Where it gets really juicy is on the national level, because various different organizations have tried and failed to lobby the national Tory government for the rights of renters. And that's been a very complicated process. And some national organizations have therefore just thought, well, let's just try and get Labour on board and hope that they win, which is a terrible strategy, as is hopefully evident now. We have actually won quite a lot of stuff from the Tories over the last 5 years. And that's because, not always because we've been in the room, but because we've managed to demonstrate and give voice to the scale of an issue, and propose some policy alternatives. Sometimes they haven't recognized, sometimes they don't say, well, look, we saw this in this local group around private renting, we thought it was a good idea. So for example, until 2015, letting agents could charge you any kind of a fee for any kind of service. So if you said, oh, I need a photocopy of my tenancy agreement, they would say, oh, well, that's £100 in order to whatever. And so we campaigned against that, and eventually, they regulated. But that's about bringing an ecosystem of organizations with you. we've campaigned around evictions and against the no fault eviction clause, section 21 here, which basically means that as long as they fill out the form correctly, you have no right to stay in the home at the end of your fixed term. So if you have a 6-month contract, you can stay till then, and then they can kick you out. The government actually copied our press release of our campaign about ending section 21 word for word in their statement that they were going to end section 21. So they really did actually look around. They were worried about labor in 2019. They said, oh, we need to speak to renters. What are renters saying? Let's do that. But now that they're not scared of labor anymore, it's a bit of a slower process. So what we've done is, in recognition of that ecosystem and the fact that we have to get shelter on side, we have to get crisis on side, we have to get the Citizens Advice Bureau on side, some of these people who are, in a revolving door and speaking to the government all the time, we created a coalition called the Renters Reform Coalition. And that is, trying to bring together all of the different voices who want to speak about this new law around evictions. So rather than us standing over here on the far left saying, all of our demands and hoping they get picked up, we're trying to have that negotiation amongst different housing organizations, so that then all of those groups go to the government and say, well, look, this is what we think it should look like. That's a pretty complicated process, and it's not that easy, but I think it is pretty beneficial, and we actually got Shelter. I was in a meeting with the head of campaigns of Shelter 2 years ago saying, you need to come. They hadn't even come out against this evictions law, section 21. And we said, look, the political climate is with you. It's clearly, feeding the homelessness crisis. There isn't any rationale for it. And they said, oh yeah, we disagree with it, but we're trying to find the right moment. And we said, well, this is the right moment. We'll give it to you. It's going to be in 2 months' time. We're going to do this thing, and we want you to come out. And they did. So it does feel like we've been able to kind of pull some of those organizations to the left a bit. And I guess that's been our primary strategy in terms of, because we're not going to get a lot out of speaking to, Boris Johnson or the Michael Gove, who is now the head of the Department of Housing. We've just been invited to go and speak to the Department for Housing, and we do kind of speak to them sometimes when it feels helpful. But unless you flex your muscle, you don't get a lot out of those meetings. Generally, they say, oh, so interesting, and then they go away. I think that's what I would say about it. It's exciting that we're now getting to the point of being in the room and trying to, negotiate around the content of those laws. But it's also quite stressful and tiring when you're working with a government that has no plan or because they just grab something randomly and you can't really engage in an ongoing kind of process with them. So I don't know if that's at all relevant.
Yeah, definitely. We're also familiar with the last thing you mentioned. And
yes, the only difference being that at least on the paper, the communication of the British government, according to housing, seems, I don't know, more substantial and more, I don't know. There is much more content than in Croatian case, and the communication. Well, still on paper, visible online, proactive communication explaining various sections of the housing, of the laws regulating housing seems I don't know, sincere and and positive towards towards people, and trying to explain what are their in which cases, well, the law protects them and how is it regulated, and we miss all of that at the moment. So that there is much more to advocate.
And I would also add that there's a lot of space. What you mentioned, working on the local level, which we do have a lot of space in larger cities in Croatia to work on this level, but also this conversation is kind of part of creating this network, what you mentioned. So creating this kind of unified front, which we still need to kind of build up here, because of this, what I mentioned, these organized groups of renters, and what we discussed also before, where people do not perceive their status of tenants as something continuous, which lasts for years. So we are kind of trying to build up also through this conversation, and organize and empower people to join and to express also their voices, but also to engage with people who are dealing or are working with some communities who are directly discriminated in this process, and try to create a network so we could address this issue. For instance, we are now having exchanges of two important laws. I mean, one is at the moment being worked on, which is labor law, and another one is announced law on rents, which we are trying actually to organize with other groups and trying to influence. So what you mentioned, I think it's highly important to organize and address these issues also through public actions, but also through direct pressure on the entities which are bringing this kind of law, in order to make them more just and to create a better living environment in terms of housing policies. So with this, if there are no additional comments from public, and I don't see any hands. Yeah, so I would like to thank you once again, Jacob, for joining us and giving us your thoughts and comments and experience from London and London Renters Union, and hopefully we'll be meeting more and working together also on some common issues. So thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for participating in this discussion as well. And I think it was, I don't know, for me it was quite interesting this evening, and thank you, Jacob.
Yeah, and for others, feel free to.
A lot, folks.
Yeah.
No, just thanks a lot for having me, and certainly, you know, interested to continue an exchange of experiences, you know, around how you folks are working on the issues when, as you say, there's a bit less content coming from the government and less regulation and stuff. So let's, you know, keep emailing if stuff comes up and have a chat.
Definitely.
Yes, we will, and I don't know. Yes, we will inform you on our advocacy steps that are coming.
And thanks once again to all the guests who have been participating, and I invite everybody to follow also the work and contact us regarding the housing issues. So thank you all, and till next chance.
Have a good night. See you.
Bye.
Take care, folks. Bye.